What if I told you Donald J. Trump just made one of the most consequential housing decisions in decades, without a headline, without a vote, and without Wall Street noticing in time? Because this is exactly what just happened. So while the media was distracted and the political class was focused elsewhere, Trump quietly moved to cut large institutional investors out of the single-family housing market, the exact homes everyday Americans are fighting to buy. And the moment that this started to sink in, the people who built an entire business model around buying up your neighborhoods, they started to feel it. Now, we're talking about firms like Blackstone, one of the largest players in single-family home ownership, and the same global elites who gather every year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, deciding how the rest of us are supposed to live. Now, if you've been priced out of a starter home, if you've ever watched investors outbid families with cash and special financing, if you felt like the American dream was quietly slipping away, this is the part you weren't supposed to notice. Because Trump didn't make noise about it. He didn't brag. He didn't telegraph the move. He just simply set the pieces in motion. And now Wall Street is realizing they may have lost their biggest cash cow yet. And once the United States Congress gets involved, this gets even bigger than that. Now, stick with me, guys, because this silence, the silence is the story. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. All right, folks, here's what most people missed. Donald J. Trump, now back in the Oval Office, made a housing decision that would normally trigger wall-to-wall coverage, and he did it almost silently. No rally, no emergency press conference, no primetime address. Trump moved to block large institutional investors from buying additional single-family homes, and that silence was deliberate. This was not a messaging failure. It was a strategy. Firms like Blackstone, some of the largest owners of single-family homes in America, didn't immediately react because, well, they didn't think it was real or enforceable or urgent. Well, that hesitation mattered. These are the same players deeply embedded with the World Economic Forum, who gather every year in Davos to talk about reshaping global economics. They assumed that this was noise until it wasn't. So by the time Wall Street realized Trump wasn't bluffing, the window to shape the narrative had already closed. And that delay right there, this is exactly what made this move so dangerous for them. So this is where the quiet becomes the weapon. Loud politics invites early resistance. It gives Wall Street time to mobilize lobbyists, line up friendly media, and pressure lawmakers before a policy ever takes shape. Trump didn't give them that luxury. So by saying less, he actually allowed institutional investors to stay exposed, assuming nothing had fundamentally changed. Now, that silence kept firms like Blackstone comfortable, and comfort breeds complacency. They just kept on operating under the old rules, still buying, still bidding, still assuming Washington would stall. Meanwhile, Trump let the implications sink in slowly, not for voters, but for the people whose balance sheets were suddenly at risk. Now, this wasn't weakness, it was patience. And patience is deadly when your opponent relies on early warning signals. Now, Wall Street didn't panic at first because panic requires clarity, and Trump denied them that on purpose. And by the time the scope of the move became clear, the damage was already being priced in. This is why this hit harder than any speech ever could. Now, here's the part most people are missing. This wasn't a broad feel-good housing gesture. This was precision. The restriction zeroes in on single-family homes, not luxury towers, not office parks, not even commercial real estate. That decision, that specific distinction, actually matters because it strikes the most reliable profit engines for firms like Blackstone. Entry-level houses deliver steady rent, low vacancy, and predictable appreciation, exactly the kind of asset institutional models are built around. So, by moving against that segment, Donald J. Trump didn't wage an ideological war on markets. He targeted a very specific revenue stream. Luxury properties can wait. Commercial real estate is already shaky. Single-family rentals, they were the safe harbor. And that's why the reaction felt delayed. Wall Street didn't think anyone would touch the golden goose. But when you remove institutional access to starter homes, you don't just slow buying, you disrupt valuation models and financing assumptions and long-term portfolio strategies. This wasn't symbolic, this was surgical. And once investors realized which asset class was in the crosshairs, the math changed overnight. So this is where it gets worse. Institutional investors, they didn't just buy homes, they bought the exact homes first-time home buyers needed. That's right. First-time home buyers needed 2- and 3-bedroom houses in growing metro areas, starter neighborhoods, fixer-uppers, places like Phoenix, Atlanta, Tampa, even Charlotte became prime hunting grounds because demand was guaranteed. The playbook was simple. Come in with cash, bid above market value, and lock in preferential financing regular families could never have access to. Banks negotiate better rates with massive buyers. Families don't get that call. So young couples weren't losing bids because they were irresponsible. They were losing to institutions with structural advantages. This is why President Donald Trump aimed here, not to punish success, but to restore competition. When corporations crowd out first-time home buyers, ownership quietly shifts. Now, what you're watching unfold here in this story, this isn't just about gas prices or lawsuits. This is about instability. And that same instability shows up in people's finances. Now, this policy draws a line and says that the starter home is not a Wall Street asset class. So they didn't panic right away. No. And that's the telltale sign right there. The assumption inside Wall Street was simple. This would stall. It would get watered down or just die quietly. Firms like Blackstone have seen proposals come and go for years. Talk is cheap. Enforcement is rare. So the initial response was disbelief, not fear. But then the realization set in. Donald J. Trump wasn't just floating an idea. He was calling on the United States Congress to codify it. Now that changes timelines, risk models, and assumptions overnight. Lobbying doesn't work the same when the president's already aligned and public opinion is stacked against corporate homebuyers. So this is where the too late feeling creeps in. By the time institutional investors understood the seriousness, they were reacting, no longer shaping outcomes. Panic doesn't come from the policy itself. It comes from realizing that the old playbook won't save you this time. Silence delayed the alarm, and delayed alarms cost money. So when the market finally responded, it wasn't subtle. The reaction around Blackstone and housing-exposed firms wasn't about today's profits. It was about tomorrow's restrictions. Wall Street prices the future, and suddenly the future included a shrinking pipeline of single-family acquisitions. That matters because these firms aren't valued on what they own today, but on what they can reliably acquire next. Remove access to entry-level homes, and the growth assumptions crack. Financing becomes tighter, expansion slows, portfolio projections get revised downward. This wasn't a knee-jerk sell-off. It was a recalibration. Now here's the key. Markets moved before Congress acted. Now that tells you investors believe that this has legs. Donald J. Trump didn't need a signed bill to shift expectations. He shifted confidence. Once Wall Street starts pricing in restriction, the leverage flops. The damage isn't theoretical anymore. It's reflected quietly in valuations. Now, if we layer in the timing, Donald J. Trump signals this policy before the annual gathering at Davos. This is the home field of the World Economic Forum. Now, that matters because Davos isn't a conference. It's basically a coordination hub. This is where capital allocators, policymakers, and CEOs align narratives and pressure points. So firms like Blackstone aren't just attendees. They're institutional partners. Their influence depends on predictability and access. So by teeing up a policy that undercuts a core asset class ahead of Davos, Trump forces the conversation onto enemy terrain. Now, there's no quiet workaround when everyone is in the same room and the policy is already moving. Now, this isn't theater. This is leverage. Trump didn't show up to negotiate the premise. He arrived with it set. Davos becomes a spotlight, not a shield. And when elites can't quietly fix a problem, their power weakens in real time. So here's the ideological conclusion, once and only once. The worldview behind the World Economic Forum treats housing as a financial instrument first and a human necessity second. So basically, homes are portfolios, neighborhoods are yield, stability is optional. That model thrives when ownership consolidates quietly. Trump's line, people live in homes, not corporations, cuts directly right through that framework. Now, this doesn't just block transactions. It challenges the assumptions that everything should be financialized. This is why this policy triggers such resistance from Davos-aligned elites. It threatens a system where control grows as ownership concentrates. Now, I want you to notice what's not happening right now. There's no loud argument that's about helping families. The pushback is procedural, legal, technical, because emotionally, this lands with the public. And when a policy both polls well and constrains elite leverage, it becomes dangerous to those who rely on quiet accumulation. This is the real reason that this move hit a nerve. So this is the hardest part of the housing policy, and it's where politicians fail. You can't fix affordability by crashing prices without destroying the equity of millions of families who already own homes. So Donald J. Trump, he understood that trap, and he deliberately avoided it. Instead of flooding the market or forcing price controls, he targeted who was allowed to compete for supply. Now, that distinction matters. Under the previous administration, inflation exploded housing costs from every angle. Materials, labor rates, these are pricing younger Americans out while doing nothing to protect long-term value. Trump chose a third path. He protected homeowners by preserving equity, while reopening access to first-time home buyers by removing institutional overbidding. So this is not about punishing success. This is about restoring balance. When corporations with unlimited capital compete against families, prices detach from reality. Trump's move cuts that distortion at the source without detonating the market. This is why Wall Street didn't see it coming. They assumed fixed housing meant collapsing prices. Instead, Trump fixed competition. So why didn't this dominate the headlines? Follow the incentives. Large institutional investors, they don't just buy homes, they buy influence. Media companies, they depend on advertisers, sponsors, and financial access that's tied directly or indirectly to asset managers like Blackstone. A story that frames corporate housing as the problem doesn't fit neatly into that ecosystem. This is not a conspiracy rant. This is structural reality. Stories that threaten institutional legitimacy. They get softened, delayed, or even buried under process coverage. So this is why the focus drifted to procedure instead of impact and speculation instead of consequence. Silence benefits the people with time and money to shape the outcomes. That's why this matters. When a policy hurts concentrated power and helps everyday buyers, it doesn't get amplified. It gets minimized. But markets noticed anyway. Investors noticed anyway. And once that happens, media coverage becomes reactive, not preventive. So by the time the headlines catch up, the leverage has already shifted. Now here's the final alignment moment, and we only need it once. Outside Wall Street boardrooms, this policy lands cleanly. Families that are trying to buy their first home don't see market intervention, they see a fair shot. Now, renters watching prices leap year after year don't hear ideology, they hear relief. And homeowners protecting their equity, they don't feel threatened, they feel stabilized. That's why Donald J. Trump didn't need a marketing campaign. The logic speaks for itself. Stop corporations from crowding out the families, and access suddenly improves without detonating the values. It's one of the rare housing moves that doesn't pit generations against each other. Notice who isn't celebrating. Large asset managers like Blackstone. Now, that contrast tells you everything. When a policy draws broad public approval while triggering elite resistance, it's usually because it resets an imbalance that benefited the few. Now, this didn't need to be loud to be popular. It just needed to be fair. And so now comes the inflection point. The United States Congress is now being asked to codify the restriction. And this is where permanence enters the picture. If this becomes law, institutional dominance over single-family housing doesn't just pause. It structurally recedes. Capital reallocates, competition normalizes, families regain leverage at the margins that matter the most. Now, that doesn't mean Wall Street disappears from housing. It means the starter home stops being treated like a yield instrument, and it starts being treated like a place to live again. Now, that shift, this would ripple through pricing models, lending practices, and even long-term planning, quietly, steadily, and without chaos. And that's the through line of this entire move. Donald J. Trump didn't make noise because noise warns opponents. He moved first, he let assumptions fail, and he forced a delayed reaction. So by the time the implications became clear, the balance of power had already shifted. Drop a like, subscribe. We'll see you next time, guys.